terrifying truth about the 10 plagues of Egypt. For centuries, the story of the 10 plagues has echoed through time, stirring both wonder and fear. But beyond the familiar verses lies a terrifying truth, one that challenges everything we think we know about God's justice and power. The plagues were not just random punishments, they were a direct challenge to Egypt's gods and a revelation of the living God's supremacy. Each plague shattered a false sense of security, exposing the fragility of human pride and the limits of earthly power. As we journey into this ancient account, prepare to see the 10 plagues like never before, as signs, as judgments, and as divine messages that still speak today. This is more than a Bible story. It's a wake-up call across the ages. Join us on Ancient Light as we uncover these mysteries together. Comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another revelation from the past that still shakes the present. 1. Blood in the waters, the death of false power. The Nile River was the pride of Egypt, its lifeblood, its glory, and its God. People depended on it for survival, worshipped it for blessing, and trusted it as an unshakable force of nature. But in a single moment, that lifeline turned to blood. The water that once gave life now gave off the stench of death. Fish floated lifeless on the surface, and the people were left horrified, scrambling for fresh water. This was not just an environmental disaster, it was a spiritual strike. By turning the Nile into blood, God struck at the heart of Egypt's religious system. The Nile was sacred, tied to gods like Hapi, the god of the flood and fertility. But in one act, the God of Israel revealed that even Egypt's strongest deity was powerless before him. The priests, known for their rituals and magic, were helpless. They could neither stop the plague nor reverse it. Pharaoh, known for his authority and divine status, could only stand by in anger as his kingdom crumbled around him. Yet his heart remained stubborn. He refused to release the Israelites even as the Nile bled, a warning he could not ignore. The people of Egypt were left shattered. They dug along the riverbanks for drinkable water, desperate to survive. Daily life was thrown into chaos. Markets closed, temples were silenced, and the once bustling river became a symbol of judgment. God was making it clear he alone held power over life and death. But behind this act was also a call for change. God was not only confronting Egypt, he was awakening his own people. The Israelites, enslaved for centuries, saw that their God was not silent, not absent, but a deliverer who moves in power. The Nile's transformation was the first blow in a battle for freedom, one that would echo through history as a testimony of divine justice and unstoppable deliverance. 2. Frogs, the gods that couldn't save. When the Nile turned to blood, Egypt was shaken, but Pharaoh's heart remained hard. So God unleashed the second plague, frogs. They came not in handfuls but in swarms, pouring out of the river's canals and even the royal palace. Frogs invaded every space, bedrooms, ovens, kneading bowls, until the people were driven to the edge of madness. To Egypt, frogs were sacred, tied to Heket, the goddess of fertility and childbirth, often depicted with a frog's head. The people believed these creatures were a symbol of life and blessing. But now the very symbol they honored became a curse. The frogs, once praised, turned into an unbearable infestation that no one could escape. Pharaoh's magicians could mimic the plague on a small scale, but they could not stop it. Their power was limited, a pale shadow against the divine force that covered the land. Pharaoh, seeing his people cry out in misery, begged Moses and Aaron to pray to God for relief, but his heart was not yet humbled. When Moses prayed and the frogs died, the land was filled with heaps of rotting carcasses. The air turned foul, the streets were lined with decay. What was meant to be a source of life had now become a stench of judgment. Egypt's gods were silent, their promises shattered by the God of Israel's unstoppable hand. Yet through it all, Pharaoh remained unchanged. The cries of his people softened his resolve only temporarily. Once the frauds were gone, he hardened his heart again, unwilling to acknowledge the God who ruled over all. This plague was a warning, a sign of things to come, but Egypt, blinded by pride, refused to listen. 3. Gnats, the breath of death. As the last of the dead frauds were swept away, Egypt barely had time to breathe before the next blow struck. With a wave of Aaron's staff, the dust of the earth transformed into gnats. Suddenly the air was thick with them, tiny, relentless, biting. They swarmed over man and beast alike, crawling into eyes, nostrils, ears, and hair. There was no escape, no rest, and no relief from the torment that fell upon the land. The priests and magicians of Egypt, so confident before, were now powerless. They attempted their spells, hoping to imitate or stop the plague, but they failed. For the first time, they admitted defeat. Standing before Pharaoh, they whispered in fear, "This is the finger of God." Yet even as his advisors trembled, Pharaoh's heart remained unyielding, locked in pride and defiance. The people were desperate, slapping at the insects, covering their faces and retreating into their homes. What once was a proud civilization, polished and ordered, was reduced to chaos and filth. Daily life came to a halt, as both rich and poor faced the same affliction, their dignity stripped away by an invisible army summoned from the dust. The gnats were more than a nuisance. They were a divine message. Egypt's earth gods and gods of harvest were rendered powerless. The ground, once seen as a giver of bounty, now birthed only affliction. God was declaring his mastery not just over the waters, but over the very dust of the earth, showing that no realm was beyond his reach. Amid this, the Israelites watched. For them, it was not only a sign of God's power, but of his presence. After centuries of silence, God was moving. The plagues were not just judgments on Egypt, they were announcements of deliverance, a promise that oppression would soon end. But Pharaoh, blind to the truth, clenched his fists tighter, setting the stage for even greater devastation to come. 4. Flies, the invasion of darkness. Before Egypt could recover from the torment of gnats, another wave of terror descended. This time it came with a roar. Swarms of flies filled the skies, darkening the sun, invading homes, marketplaces, and palaces. They covered food-filled drinking vessels and crawled across skin. The once majestic empire was reduced to swatting, shuddering, and shutting doors in a futile attempt to keep the plague at bay. The flies were not just pests, they were a direct blow to Egypt's gods. Beelzebub, the so-called Lord of the Flies, and other deities associated with protection were mocked by the very creatures they were thought to control. The message was unmistakable. The God of Israel reigned supreme over nature, and no idol could stand in his presence. Egypt's gods were crumbling under the weight of heaven's judgment. Yet amid the chaos, a strange miracle unfolded. In the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, not a single fly was found. While Egypt groaned under the plague, God made a clear distinction between his people and their oppressors. It was a sign of both protection and purpose, a reminder that Israel was set apart, chosen for deliverance. Pharaoh, desperate to restore order, called for Moses and Aaron. He offered a compromise, allowing the Israelites to sacrifice to their God, but only within Egypt. But Moses refused. God's command was clear. His people were to go into the wilderness to worship. Pharaoh, cornered and furious, agreed only to harden his heart once the flies were gone. As the swarms disappeared at God's command, Egypt was left reeling. Dead flies carpeted the ground, their stench filling the air, a grim reminder of the battle unfolding between God and Pharaoh. But the king, blinded by pride, refused to yield. Egypt's suffering would deepen, and the stage was set for even darker judgments. Through it all, the God of Israel revealed his power, not just to crush oppressors, but to preserve his own. 5. Diseased livestock, the collapse of economic pride. As the last flies disappeared, a heavy stillness fell over Egypt, but it was only the calm before the next storm. Without warning, disease swept across the land, striking down Egypt's livestock. Horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats collapsed in fields, their bodies littering the roads and pastures. What once was Egypt's pride, its wealth, its economy, its military power, now rotted under the scorching sun. The Egyptians were left stunned. No god of cattle or harvest came to their aid. Apis, the sacred bull worshipped across Egypt, was silent. Hathor, the goddess of love and fertility, offered no help. The mighty empire watched helplessly as its symbols of prosperity withered before their eyes. Markets fell quiet, caravans stopped, and fields turned into graveyards for beasts once praised as divine gifts. Once again, God made a sharp distinction. In the land of Goshen, where the Israelites dwelled, not a single animal was lost. The Egyptians could only look on in disbelief as their own herds perished while their slaves' flocks stood untouched. It was a sign that the God of Israel was not only a deliverer, but a protector, guarding his people in the midst of devastation. Pharaoh, faced with economic ruin, sent officials to verify the reports. When they confirmed that none of Israel's livestock had died, Pharaoh's heart remained cold. His pride blinded him to the warnings unfolding before his very eyes. The collapse of Egypt's wealth, meant to humble him, only hardened his resolve to resist the God who was shaking his kingdom to the core. The disease marked a turning point. Egypt's foundation was crumbling, its gods, its wealth, its power, all falling under God's judgment. And still Pharaoh clung to his throne, setting himself against the very hand that held back even greater destruction. As the stench of death filled the land, a spiritual war was raging, one that would soon reach its breaking point. 6. Boils, the shattering of human pride. Without warning, Moses and Aaron took handfuls of soot from a furnace and threw it into the air before Pharaoh. As the dark dust drifted on the wind, it settled onto skin, and suddenly boils erupted across Egypt. Painful burning sores broke out on people and animals alike, covering bodies with raw wounds that no ointment or magic could heal. Egypt, once proud and polished, was now disfigured and groaning in agony. The magicians who had once tried to match Moses' miracles were no longer standing at Pharaoh's side. They were crippled by the same affliction, unable to appear before the king, humiliated before the very people they once impressed. Their gods of health and healing, like Imhotep, were powerless to stop the spread of suffering. God was dismantling Egypt's pride, breaking it at the level of the body. This plague struck every class from servant to royalty. Pharaoh himself was not exempt. Covered in sores, his rage grew, but his heart remained defiant. He saw his kingdom in ruins, his people in misery, yet still refused to humble himself. The warnings had been clear, the signs undeniable, but Pharaoh clung to the illusion of control even as his world burned. For the Israelites, this moment was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. While they watched Egypt writhe in pain, they saw the God of their fathers acting with power and precision. It was a reminder that their deliverance was near, that the God who had heard their cries was now shaking the empire that enslaved them. Freedom was no longer a distant hope, it was taking form before their eyes. As the boils festered and spread, Egypt's pride was reduced to ash. Its healers were defeated, its king was shamed, and its people were brought low. But the greatest tragedy was not the physical pain, it was Pharaoh's heart, hard as stone, resisting the very God who could have ended his nation's suffering. The stage was set for even greater blows, and the battle between heaven and Pharaoh was far from over. 7. Hail fire from the sky. As Pharaoh's defiance grew, God sent a warning unlike any before. A hailstorm was coming, fierce enough to destroy everything in its path. Moses lifted his staff, and the skies darkened. Thunder cracked like the roar of heaven, and hail mixed with fire rained down upon Egypt. Stones of ice shattered roofs, crushed crops, and killed anyone left in the fields. Egypt, once proud of its power, trembled under a storm it could not control. The hail was more than weather. It was a judgment against Egypt's sky gods like Nut and Shu, and against Seth, the supposed god of storms. But they were silent, offering no protection. Pharaoh watched his kingdom shatter, his fields, ruined, his people fleeing in terror. This was no ordinary storm. It was the fist of God pounding Egypt's pride into the dust. Some Egyptians, hearing Moses' warning, brought their servants and animals inside, fearing the God of Israel. Slowly, even among Egypt's people, the truth was spreading. Pharaoh was not the highest power. But Pharaoh himself, though shaken, clung to his throne. As soon as the storm stopped, his heart hardened again, and the cries of his people were drowned by his stubborn pride. For the Israelites, the storm was both terrifying and hopeful. While chaos reigned in Egypt, Goshen stood untouched. They watched hail crash down in the distance, knowing they were under the hand of the God who had not forgotten them. Each plague was a step toward freedom, each blow a crack in Egypt's iron grip over their lives. When the hail ceased, Egypt was left in ruins. Trees, splintered, fields leveled, and the land scarred by fire and ice. Pharaoh called Moses, admitting his sin and begging for the storm to end. But the moment relief came, his repentance faded, and his pride returned. The pattern was clear. Pharaoh's heart was a battlefield, and the war between God's will and human arrogance was far from over. 8. Locusts, the devouring storm. After the hail left Egypt battered and broken, God's next strike came as a living storm. Moses stretched out his staff, and a wind rose from the east carrying an army of locusts, unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. They came in black waves, darkening the sky and swallowing the land. Fields that had barely survived the hail were now stripped bare, as every leaf, stalk, and blade of grass vanished under gnawing jaws. The locusts invaded homes, marketplaces, and royal courts. The air hummed with their wings. Their constant rustling sounded like a death song over the land. Egypt's gods of fertility and harvest, such as Men and Isis, offered no salvation. Once again, Egypt was shown that the God of Israel reigned supreme, not just over storms and sickness, but over the very sustenance of life. Pharaoh's officials, desperate and terrified, pleaded with him to release the Israelites. Do you not yet realize they begged that Egypt is ruined? For a moment, Pharaoh wavered. He called Moses and Aaron and offered a compromise. Let the men go worship, but leave the women and children behind. But Moses stood firm, knowing God's demand was total freedom for all, no half measures. As the locusts devoured what little remained, Pharaoh's mask of control crumbled. He begged Moses to pray for mercy, and Moses did. God shifted the wind, sweeping the locusts into the Red Sea. Egypt breathed a sigh of relief, but Pharaoh's heart once again turned to stone. The cycle of disaster and defiance tightened its grip, driving Egypt ever closer to collapse. For the Israelites, the locusts were a sign that the end of their captivity was near. They saw Egypt humbled its power, dismantled its gods, discredited. Yet they also saw God's precision, a force mighty enough to judge a nation, yet merciful enough to spare his people. The devouring swarm was not just a plague. It was a signal that a long night was coming, and with it, their long-awaited deliverance. 9. Darkness, the silence of the gods. After the locusts vanished into the sea, Egypt hoped for peace, but instead came a darkness that defied nature itself. Moses lifted his hand toward the sky, and an unnatural night fell over the land. For 3 days, thick darkness smothered Egypt, a blackness so deep it could be felt. Lamps flickered and died. No fire could pierce the heavy gloom. People groped through their homes, paralyzed with terror and unable to see even their own hands. This was not just the absence of light. It was the defeat of Egypt's greatest deity, Ra, the sun god, the supposed giver of life and order. In a single act, God shattered the illusion of Egypt's might. Their most trusted god was silent, their empire plunged into chaos. What had been the pride of the world was now a kingdom suffocating in fear and despair. Pharaoh's grip began to tremble. He summoned Moses, offering a desperate compromise. The Israelites could go, but they must leave their flocks and herds behind. But Moses refused, declaring that they needed everything to worship God properly. Pharaoh's patience snapped. Enraged, he warned Moses never to appear before him again, threatening death if he did. Yet even in this suffocating darkness, the land of Goshen remained filled with light. The Israelites watched as God once again marked them as his own, preserving them amid judgment. Each plague had deepened their understanding of God's power, but this one revealed something even greater: his ability to bring light into the darkest places. The 3 days of darkness were not just a punishment, they were a warning. They foreshadowed the final blow yet to come, a night far darker than any Egypt had known. Pharaoh's stubborn heart had led his people to the edge of ruin, and though the sun would rise again, the next dawn would carry the weight of judgment. The stage was set for the final devastating plague that would break Egypt at last. 10. Death of the Firstborn. The darkness lifted, but an eerie silence settled over Egypt, a silence heavy with dread. Then came God's final word: every firstborn in Egypt would die. From Pharaoh's son to the lowest servant's child, even the firstborn of animals, none would be spared. This was not just a plague, it was the breaking point, the blow that would pierce the heart of the empire and expose its deepest vulnerability. God commanded the Israelites to prepare. Each family was to sacrifice a spotless lamb and mark their doorposts with its blood. This was the first Passover, a night when death would sweep through Egypt, yet pass over every home, marked by faith and obedience. As the Israelites gathered in trembling expectation, Egypt remained unaware, clinging to its crumbling gods, and a king blinded by pride. At midnight, the angel of death moved silently through Egypt's streets. Cries erupted from every house, from Pharaoh's palace to the humblest dwelling. Mothers wept over lifeless children. Fathers collapsed under the weight of grief. The land that had once mocked the God of Israel now lay shattered, its strength broken, its heart crushed beyond recognition. Pharaoh, who had once called himself a god, now staggered in defeat. His own son, the heir to Egypt's throne, lay lifeless. With trembling hands, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the dead of night, his voice cracked with agony. "Go," he whispered, "take your people and leave us." The man who had defied God was now undone, his empire humbled under divine judgment. As dawn broke, the Israelites moved out in haste, leaving behind centuries of slavery. They carried the treasures of Egypt given freely by a people desperate to see them go. Behind them lay a nation crushed by its own rebellion, a monument to the danger of resisting the living God. But for Israel, the night of death had become the dawn of freedom, a new chapter in their story, written by the hand of the one who redeems, delivers, and never forgets his promises. The plagues were a revelation. The 10 plagues of Egypt were not random acts of destruction, they were a divine revelation. Each plague peeled back the layers of human pride, false power, and empty religion, exposing a truth that echoed through history. The God of Israel reigns supreme, and no kingdom, no matter how mighty, can stand against him. But the plagues were also a message of hope. For the Israelites, they marked the turning point from slavery to freedom, from despair to deliverance. God was not distant or silent. He was present, active, and faithful to his promises. Through judgment, he carved a path to redemption, proving that he is both just and merciful. Even today, the story of the plagues challenges us. Where do we place our trust? What false gods do we cling to when life shakes around us? The God who shook Egypt still calls to every heart, inviting us to trust in his power and mercy. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this incredible story. What stood out to you the most? Share your insights in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Ancient Light for more powerful biblical mysteries and timeless truths